welcome to the Parsha Pairings with Jeff and Sherry. I'm Jeff Friedlander.
And I'm Sherry.
And we're glad you joined us. This week's Parsha is called Vayera, and it means, and I appeared. It comes to us from Exodus chapter 6, verse 2, through chapter 9, verse 35. The Haftorah reading this week is Ezekiel chapter 28, verse 25, through chapter 29, verse 21. And our New Testament reading this week is Luke chapter 11, verse 14 through 22, and Romans 9, 14 through 33. We ended last week's Parsha with Moses in this conversation with God. And this Parsha, Sherry, is going to continue that conversation that he is having with Adonai about the cruel treatment that Pharaoh is putting upon the people and increasing the labor to Bnei Yisrael, the children of Israel. We left off with Adonai's response to Moses as he questioned, why in the world would the labor be so intense? God, why aren't you doing something? And we said in our commentary that it was God was putting together something Moses didn't really understand at that time. So we begin this parsha in chapter 6, starting in verse 2, and we're continuing the dialogue where it says, God spoke to Moshe and said to him, I am the Lord. I appeared to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob as God Almighty. In Hebrew, that's El Shaddai. But by my name, Yud-He, Vav-He. The Lord, I did not make myself known to them. So he said, I made myself known as El Shaddai, this all-powerful God.
Right.
But I didn't tell them Yud-He, Vav-He. I didn't give them that name. Now, in Hebrew thought, this is a really important concept. In Hebraic thought and in the names of the scriptures, names indicate they're not just some arbitrary designation like how to identify a person by, getting them to hear you. Hey, Sherry. That's Jeff. Where are you? That's in Hebrew, it's a different idea. It communicates this nature and the essence of who the person really is, or the being, in this case, God. So when God identifies himself as Yud-He, Vav-He, there is a lot in that. Now, in this commentary today, we are not digging into that. There is so much. In fact, there are books, encyclopedias, entire websites, lots of teaching, all devoted to God's name. We encourage you, dig in and study Yud-He, Vav-He, and see the beauty of this name. But know for now, in Moses' world, when he was given this name, it was a big deal because it indicated to him that God was, and the big kind of takeaway in our generic commentary here is, it is the name that says, I have always been, I am now, and I will always be. I am past, I am present, and I am future. So that name says all-encompassing God. Never, there's not a moment that God is not invested in what is happening. And Moses realizes there's a reputation here of this God. This God is not like other gods. He's not limited to time.
Right.
He's not limited in power, and he's certainly not limited in his actions. He transcends, and we're going to see that in this parsha, that the Egyptian gods, little g, that he's going to be dealing with, they have to take a back seat to this God. This is the God.
Right.
Yud-He, Vav-He.
I was just going to also add that one of the things that you talked about is the Hebraic culture. And we've seen this as we've seen the names of the children of Israel. We've seen the names of Abram to Abraham, Sarai to Sarah, what their names mean. And even Moses, our main character in Exodus, means drawn from the water, which represents the salvation of how God rescued him. So much different than a Western mindset where we pick names that just sound good together, or how we like initials, how they'll look, in a Hebraic worldview, you're naming with that attribute being attached to that child.
And what's so interesting, Sherry, in that, even in when you name something, you see so many characteristics that God puts in and uses. You brought up Moses, right? So Moshe means to draw out, because he was drawn out of the water.
Right.
In Latin, the word education, it comes from the word educar in Latin, and it actually means to draw out. So to educate somebody is to draw out of them something.
So should we have named our children Educar?
Educar. But think about Moses. What does he end up doing?
Right.
He's not only the prophet, he is the educator of all of Israel. He brings the law. He brings the Torah. He's used by God to educate on God's ways.
Yeah.
So even in a symbolic sense, not only was he physically drawn out of the water, but he becomes an educator in the future. So names play an important role,
Names
and we
are
encourage
important.
you guys to look into that.
So God talks to, is explaining this, and then he goes on and he recounts again this covenant that he's made with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And he is basically setting the stage for, I'm going to fulfill this covenant now. Up until this time, El Shaddai was sufficient for their revelation.
Yeah.
Now, with what he's about to do, they need Yod He Vav He.
Need the bigger
So he sets all this up, and he declares, Adonai declares to Moses, I've heard the groanings of Bnei Israel, whom the Egyptians are keeping in bondage. So I have remembered my covenant.
Yeah.
Now, I want to talk about this word remember,
Yeah.
because in Hebrew it means zakar. The word is zakar. And it doesn't mean he remembered like he was like, oh, yeah, I forgot about that.
Being that God doesn't have memory lapses. just for
Right.
the
I mean,
record.
it's been 400 years they've been in Egypt, and it's not like he just went, oh, yeah, I forgot about that little
I was on the
people
other side
group."
of the universe taking care of some stuff.
Right. So zakar means to recall
Yeah.
or to actually bring back to mind.
Yeah.
We can remember this when we do what we call zikaron, which a lot of people know it as communion, when we take the elements of the bread and the wine to remember, to zakar.
Because Yeshua made that comment, right? He said, when you do this in the future, when you break the bread, when you take the wine, remember me.
Right. Now, and this is not the first time we've actually seen this word zakar used. We see it in Genesis 8:1 when he says he will remember Noah. He will zakar Noah. We see it in Genesis 9:15 when he says he will remember the flood covenant when the rainbow was put in the sky. He said this will zakar me. Every time I see the rainbow, I'm going to recall the promise that I made. We see this in Genesis 19:29 when he says he remembered Lot. When he went to go destroy Sodom, he remembered, he called to attention the negotiation that he had made with Abraham. In Genesis 30:22, we see that he remembered Rachel and he opened her womb. We see in Genesis 42:9 that Joseph remembers the dreams when he sees his brothers. Remember, it's been 20 plus years, and he's Zakar's. And then in Exodus 2:24, we're seeing that God said, back last week's parsha, he remembered his covenant. He Zakared his covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. When he heard Bnei Yisrael cry out, and he recounts that again. I'm calling back to memory.
And so it's very positive, very good. You want to be recalled. You want to be remembered. You want to be zakared in God's mind.
And we want to remember what God has done. So this is it's a big word here. And then we move on and we get a very powerful passage that we move into. This is actually the kind of the foundation of our whole Passover Seder experience.
Yeah, this is it.
This is based on this. And we're going to read this out of Exodus 6, verse 6 through 7. God responds and tells Moses, therefore say to Bnei Israel, I am Adonai. I will bring you out from under the burdens of the Egyptians. I will deliver you from their bondage, and I will redeem you with an outstretched arm. And with great judgments I will take you to myself as a people, and I will be your God.
It's a beautiful picture, and these are sometimes referred to, this is what becomes the Seder. This is the Passover, the Pesach we see this. And so these are sometimes called the four expressions of redemption. And we're actually going to compare that to the salvation experience of being redeemed by God. We see here he says, I will bring you out from the suffering with Egypt. That's called the sanctification, or in the Passover Seder, it's the first cup we drink,
Right.
the cup of sanctification. And this is where God says, I'm going to make you separate. I'm going to change you. I'm going to make you holy. I'm going to pull you apart. You're going to be a different people. The second cup is called the cup of deliverance, and it's a cup where they're delivered from the plagues. And that's where he says, I will save you from this enslavement. The third cup is the cup of redemption. And that cup is where he says, I will redeem you with an outstretched arm and with great judgment. So he's going to redeem us. In fact, in the Passover Seder, we note that it's after supper that Yeshua picked up the third cup and he drank from it, and that is where we get what became the modern practice of
Right.
communion, or what we call zikaron, remembering, where he said, and when you drink this cup in the future, remember this event, remember this,
Right.
this redemption, that I am redeeming you. And that was the third cup, which is referring right here to Exodus in chapter 6. And then the fourth cup is the cup of praise, or a hallel, a cup of being thankful, because he says, I will take you for me as a nation, and I will make you people will be my people. So he says now we have a praise there, because we get to realize we are going to become the people then. We are being brought out, we are being saved, we are being delivered. And if you think about a believer, somebody who goes to start to follow the Lord, the process of salvation, it's the same process. God moves us out of our current situation. He reveals to us that he's going to separate us from where we currently are spiritually.
We begin that process of sanctification.
Right, moving in a direction. Then he's going to save us from what? Well, he's saving us from the slavery of sin,
Right.
from the bondages that have separated us from him. Third, he's going to deliver us and give us redemption, actually. He is going to take us and say, I want relationship with you, and I am going to redeem you with my blood. I'm going to give you my blood, and that is going to pay the cost of your sin.
Wow.
And then fourthly, he says, I'm now making you my people, my child, my daughter, my son. You're now
Amen.
mine. So this expression of these four expressions is the process of salvation. Here, it's for the nation as a whole, and we experience this individually as well.
That's very good. And then in verse 9, Moses spoke this to Bnei Israel. He tells them exactly what God said, and a very sad response of how he tells God what happened.
Yeah.
When Moses spoke to Bnei Israel, they did not listen to him because of their broken spirit and their cruel bondage.
Yeah.
They had come under such oppression. They couldn't even hear, they couldn't zakar, they couldn't move into the promises of what Moses is telling them. And I think there's so many of us that go through this when we have trials and traumas in our life, that it deadens us to even being able to hear the goodness of God, the promises of God. And I think we see a spiritual warfare tactic here.
Yeah.
Moses tells this to God, and God says to him in verse 10, go speak to Pharaoh, the king of Egypt, so that he will let Bnei Israel out of the land. He sends Moses to the oppressor.
Wow.
The people can't hear. I recognize. I have compassion on them, we learned in last week's Parsha. His heart is moved because he sees what the plan is he has. But he says, go speak to the oppressor.
I mean, how beautiful is that in our life, God looks to us and he says, I want to redeem you. I want to take care of you. And then many times we don't hear him. We don't listen. We have our brokenness, our hurts. We even, like Pharaoh, maybe we harden our hearts a little bit. And yet God has a plan. And so he says, I'm going to do this regardless of you. I'm going after that which holds you enslaved.
That's right.
That's the love of God.
He speaks to our oppressors and
That's
sets
the
us
love of
free.
God. It's incredible.
So again, we have Moses then steps up and still complaining and worried and in fear about how he speaks.
And he uses an interesting phrase, doesn't
He
he?
actually says that he has uncircumcised lips.
That's an interesting phrase he chose. Why would he say this? Why would he say uncircumcised lips? Circumcision is the sign given to Abraham that he is part of the covenant. And Moses is saying, look, I may be circumcised, I may be part of this covenant, I may be Israel, but I got to tell you, not all of me.
Well, and I think it's also this idea of I have an inability to speak.
Yeah.
We hear this again in Jeremiah when he says that Israel has uncircumcised ears.
Wow.
That their ears are not able to hear.
Yeah.
So there's something about that cutting through the flesh, cutting through our ways, cutting through Moses, cutting through his fear of his speech.
Yeah.
To let the covenant flow.
Yeah, that's good.
He's just, again, I have this inability. But Adonai continues and gives Moses and Aaron a charge to bring Bnei Israel out of Egypt.
He's
Listen,
unwavering. He's like, we're doing this.
This is the plan.
Yeah.
And he continues on with this. So then we move into verses 14 and 25, and we get an introduction into Moses' parents. This is where it tells us that he's from the tribe of Levi. His dad is Amram. His mom is Jochebed. Yeah. It just kind of gives a little bit of a history there.
And in verse 26, he says, these are the same Aaron and Moses to whom Adonai said, bring Bnei Israel out from the land of Egypt according to their division. Sherry, that's an interesting word. Tell us what that word is.
So this word in Hebrew is zabah, and it actually means army, warfare, or host.
Yeah.
So we're going to see this word again when they actually are delivered out of Egypt. But it's interesting that he's recognizing there's some kind of order that's here. There's some kind of, it's not just a scattered bunch of frantic slaves like the movies show us. There is something, they have divisions, they have order, and there's a military ordering to their existence here. So
and God's going to use them that way to go to battle, to win this battle, to get them out.
That's
right.
right.
So we move into chapter 7.
And Adonai continues telling Moses and Aaron to go to Pharaoh and declare that he has let the people go. He also tells Moses that he's going to harden Pharaoh's heart. And we're going to follow this word harden
all the way through.
All the way through, because we're going to find that there's actually 3 different words, Hebrew words used to describe Pharaoh's heart.
And a lot of people have felt like, this is a challenging phrase. In fact, it's used in the New Testament too. When you read in the book of Romans and in chapter 9, where God actually, Paul is speaking, and he talks about, he quotes this stuff that God hardened Pharaoh's heart, and there's an idea that's been communicated that somehow or another God is contradicting what many have believed is free will, that we have the freedom to decide to accept or not accept God. And here it's as though, well, Pharaoh didn't get that choice. He was forced into a hardened heart.
Right.
But as you look at the Hebrew in this, and as you watch the story unfold, you'll realize that's not actually what was going on here. It's actually a different story. So the verse 3 says, I will harden Pharaoh's heart and multiply my signs and wonders in the land of Egypt. What's that word?
So this word hardened that's used here, and this is actually the only time in this parsha that this particular Hebrew word is used, is chashah, and it means to be severe and to make difficult.
Right.
So what God is saying is that there is already something in Pharaoh's heart.
Yeah.
And as these signs and wonders and miracles come about him, it's gonna make his heart even more severe. And we see that what has already happened in last week's parsha, that he is expressing severe labor on the people. So it's not that, I've heard it described this way. It's kind of like wax. Yeah. The sun can either melt it or harden it, right? Wax and clay.
Yeah.
So it's much like that with Pharaoh's heart.
And that's the reality. It's not a violation of Pharaoh's free will, but it's rather more a prophecy that what was already in Pharaoh's heart is getting solid.
Right.
It's getting more, and you'll see that as we go through here. It's going to get more and more firm as we go. So verse 4 continues on and tells us why, and it says, "But Pharaoh will not listen." And that word not listen is lo, shema. Shema. We say this prayer twice a day. We say it's hear and obey. But Pharaoh will not shema. Yeah. And this is why his heart is hardened. And we're going to see that throughout the plagues. So Adonai then goes on and tells him, I want to go back up to verse 3. He'll harden Pharaoh's heart, and he's going to multiply his signs and wonders. Now, this word for signs in Hebrew is ot,
and it means to make a mark or a signal. And the word for wonders or miracles is moftim, and that means to prove yourself. It's like a you're showing that this is who I am. So when we talk about signs and wonders, we're seeing the signs are going to signal and mark and validate authenticity.
Yeah.
We're going to see miracles are going to authenticate the greatness of who God is.
Yeah.
So both of those together, we'll watch through the story as they unfold. And then just this random piece of information that the author gives us is that in verse 7 that Moses and Aaron's ages, they're 83 and 87. And I think what's interesting here is we see, first of all, that Aaron is 4 years older than Moses. So this lets us know that probably the decree that was given over the death of the babies, Aaron was old enough to have not been under that decree.
Right.
Secondly, we see this pattern that has been emerging throughout
the scriptures.
Our parshas, right?
Yeah.
The youngest is over the oldest.
Right.
And who is one of the blessings of the firstborn is to be the ruler over the clan.
Right, to have the authority.
And we see that Moses becomes the ruler over the clan. So he gets the firstborn blessing, even though he is the youngest.
Yeah.
So then they go before Pharaoh, and sure enough, they go before Pharaoh, and Pharaoh says, "Prove yourself with a miracle. A moftim, prove it." So Aaron throws the staff down, and it turns into a snake. I thought this was interesting because this is what God spoke to Moses to do.
Right.
But remember, Moses is feeling a little nervous about talking.
Uncircumcised lips.
So he's told Aaron apparently what to do, and Aaron actually does the deed. But alas, the magicians can do the same thing. The magicians of Pharaoh's court are able to throw their staffs down, and their staffs turn into snakes as well.
Yeah.
But Aaron's staff gobbles up theirs. So God is still making a point that I'm still God, and I'm still bigger than you. But they use their magic arts, and so now it says that Pharaoh's heart was hardened, so he lo shema. We see again this pattern. He did not listen. But this word for hardened is different. This is the word chazak, which means to become resolute.
Yeah.
So he's had this severity towards God, this severity towards hearing God. Now he's like, I am resolute. I'm not listening. I'm lo shema, and I am chazak. My heart is girded up. So if you think about it,
the first word that we learned about is kind of like the seed is already there. Mm-hmm. And as God began to show his greatness through the miracle, remember the Hebrew word there was miracle. So God showed his greatness. Now it's competition. And sometimes when people are pushed up against a wall, their pride comes up. Oh. And in this case, it's like Pharaoh's pride showed up. And although he had a seed of arrogance, pride, and hardness, if you will, when God showed his greatness, his moftim, then Pharaoh's pride welled up, and he said, no, I am resolute now. I'm absolutely going to prove that I'm better.
Once he saw that his men could do the same thing. It's almost as a, well, who are you?
Yeah,
we can do the same thing.
And then we get into the plagues. So we're going to see now, in this portion we're not going to see all 10, but understand that all 10 plagues that we're going to study this week and next week are like an attack against the pantheon of gods that the Egyptians worshipped and served. And in Numbers chapter 33 and verse 4, we're told that the Egyptians buried those who had died by the 10th plague, by which the Lord executed judgments against their gods. Mm. So Numbers recounts this story, and knowing that this was a judgment against the gods of Egypt and against the people who served them. And interestingly, in the 13th century, by Yah ben Asher, and in the 15th century, Don Isaac Abravanel noted there was a repetitive pattern to these plagues. The first 3 plagues brought on by Moses' brother Aaron. He holds out his staff as the effective instrument. The next group of 3 plagues, the first 2 are brought on by God, and then the third one is by Moses. And in the last group of the 3 plagues, it's brought on by Moses holding out his arm and his staff. The last one, the very last plague, the death of the firstborn, there's no staff, there's no nothing. It's just God doing a miracle. So these patterns show that the plague is not only a literarily speaking, for those of you that like kind of the literary composition of things, it's not just a recounting. There is a pattern to how it's told, and it's intentionally, conscientiously articulated to make people see there's something going on here that was planned by God himself.
And we'll bring these out as we go through each of the ones.
So the first one is the Nile River.
It's turned to blood, and now the Nile River was worshipped as a god itself. They had they believed there was a god that blessed the overflowing, the flooding, that dropped the good soil. All this, there was a worshiping going on here throughout the flooding, and life comes out of the Nile River. And Pharaoh goes to the Nile early in the morning, the scripture tells us, and he experienced the first miracle performed by Aaron, as we said.
Yep.
The water is turned into blood.
Now, this Nile being changed to blood, the plague is against this god called Hapi, the spirit of the Nile. And this god was called the giver of life to men. So God is letting them know quickly, hey, there's only one giver of life. It's not me. They actually had annual celebrations to this god. They would worship this god. They would bow down believing this god provided true life for them. And the Lord is making sure that, no, this is not what's going to be there. I am actually the God of life.
I also took note on that these are, to the Egyptians, living waters.
Yeah.
And God turns it into blood. Now, this is not an atoning blood, but it's interesting. The first plague is blood, dealing with their gods. And the last plague we'll see next week is blood that you put over the doorpost of the blood of the lamb over the doorpost that provides a way of deliverance and escape. So you've got blood on both ends of these plagues.
And so just to wax a little more spiritual for a moment, blood is life, right? Leviticus tells us, Leviticus 17 tells us that life is in the blood, right? And we understand that it is blood that provides atonement for sin. There's some reality here of blood and water. What is life also? Well, without water, we don't physically live. We have to have life from water. We have spiritual life and life in our body from blood. So here we have the Nile, this water source. We have the blood taking it over, which becomes a death to that water source. But then we're going to have the blood, as Sherry mentioned, go over the doorpost next week, and that's going to be life again, deliverance. And what is that reminiscent of? It's prophetically speaking of the Mashiach, the Messiah. That Yeshua is, he says, you must be born of water and born of the Spirit. And then he's crucified, and the soldier comes, sticks a spear in his side, and what flows? Blood and water, showing that the redemption of the water comes from the blood, and the blood covers it and becomes atonement down the road when the Messiah comes there. And that's good news. That is the good news.
But alas, we have the magicians are able through their secret arts to do the same thing. And this just, to me, I thought this shows us that Hasatan always has a counterfeit.
Yeah.
But Pharaoh's heart is hardened again. It's chazak, it's resolute, and he lo shema. He did not listen again. It actually says he turned and went into his house and did not even take it to heart. We're going to see that word heart, lev, a lot throughout this parsha.
Yeah.
His heart was resolute in pride and position that his heart is not even receptive to miracles at this point. So we move into chapter 8.
Yeah, chapter 8, and we start with the frogs, gnats, and flies are kind of where we're going to head down in this chapter. So the first one is the frogs, and that's chapter 8. Starting in verse 1, it kind of moves through. The land was filled with the frogs, and they became an object of loathing, which is interesting because there was a goddess called Hecht, which was the goddess, and it was a frog-headed goddess that played a part in creation. And so now you've got this fertility god. It was considered a fertility god, and that was pretty high worship there.
Right.
And now they're like, dear God, get this out of here.
We don't want all these frogs, and they're all over the land.
It became
and
a
their
stench
houses.
to them. And so this is the pattern again. Adonai is speaking to Moses. Aaron stretches out his hand, his staff over the waters. The frogs come up out of the water. They invade the land. They invade the homes. And now Pharaoh's going to respond. He's going to say to Adonai, hey, get rid of these frogs. Get them out of here. I'll let you go sacrifice. I'll
Right.
let you go. No problem.
However, when Moses prays and they send the frogs away, verse 11, Pharaoh saw that there was relief. So he hardened his heart again. And lo shama. This hardened, this is our third word we see. This is chabad, and it means to be heavy, weighty, grievous, and burdensome. So there's this weight in his heart now.
Yeah.
This hardening is now this weight of, I'm sure there's this, I'm wondering what's going on here.
Yeah.
You know, I'm Pharaoh, and now there's these miracles that are happening. What's going on?
So you think about it, you got these seeds, right? You got a seed of this hardness in the beginning. Then you've got that manifesting with a resoluteness that I'm not going to stop. I'm going to win this battle. And now you've got heaviness, which might indicate, because he did speak to Adonai and say, remove the frogs and I'll let you sacrifice.
Right.
It might speak to the fact that he's saying, hey, this doesn't feel that great. I know that I'm right, but still, and I think that all of us go through some places just like that.
So God's not done sending judgments.
No, we're moving
we got
on.
the third plague, the gnats and the lice, which is it's a kind of a clinging bug.
Yeah,
it's
this
like
is
a clinging
same
insect.
pattern though, right?
Adonai speaks to Moses, and Aaron performs. These dust becomes gnats when they strike it with the staff.
Now we don't actually know for sure, Sherry, if there is we've heard there are some gods that have some names linked to this kind of flying insect, this thing, but we don't have a specific one listed in the pantheon. But the magicians, interestingly, were unable to duplicate this exact plague. And what they said in Exodus chapter 8, verse 19, they said, this is the finger of God. They said, look, we don't even have a God on this one, and we can't this is the first one they can't do. They can't duplicate it. And they're like, yep, there's another God in town. Here he is, and that is the finger of God.
And this is the first one we see that's actually attacking man and beast.
Yeah.
This one's actually on the beast and on man, and it's attacking them. So then we go to the next one, the flies, which are like stinging insects. It's kind of this idea that they're not just, annoying southern flies. These are the stingers, right?
Thinking about this just bothers me.
I know. Well, so we have Moses that meets Pharaoh again at the Nile early in the morning. This time we don't have a record. This is where we don't have Aaron recorded here.
So the pattern changes, right?
Yes, and then verse 18 through 20 says, but on that day I will set apart the land of Goshen. So he declares, I'm sending this next plague, but I'm setting Israel apart.
Yep.
B'nai Yisrael is not going to be affected by this. Where my people are dwelling, no swarm of flies will be there. So you may know, Yada, that I, Adonai, am in the midst of the earth. I will make a distinction between my people and your people. By tomorrow, this sign, this oath will happen.
Yeah.
Adonai did just so. Again, this sign right here, Adonai saying, I'm marking it. I'm putting a mark on my people that they're not affected.
And this plague might have been against this god called Kepherah, which is a scarab-headed god. Regarded as a manifestation on the earth of the god of Ra, possibly Ra, which is a sun god. It was supposed to be a god of resurrection, to bring back to life. Now think about a fly goes to the carcass of the dead. And they serve this god like it could be a god of resurrection. Perhaps, and this is kind of gross, but this this creature would roll around in a dung ball and lay its eggs, and so it would have new creation coming out of its nastiness. And actually, the Egyptian priest wore this symbol as part of their charms in Egypt. So
Pharaoh's observing this,
Yeah.
and he's aware of this god that's now being assaulted through this plague, and now he begins to try to negotiate.
Yeah.
Okay, so there's this, remember he had a heaviness. We left him with a heaviness. Now he wants to negotiate. He says, fine, go. Sacrifice in the land.
Yeah.
Moses could have jumped on this as a sign that Adonai was fulfilling his word to Pharaoh. That God was saying, that's right, I'm going to have him drive you out. But Moses knows this is not what's happening. And Moses replies in verse 22, that would not be right. For the offering we intend to sacrifice to Adonai, our God, are abominations to the Egyptians. Wouldn't they come after us if we were to do that?
And Pharaoh still wants to negotiate, Sherry. He still wants to come after him. He's like, he's going to make an offer. He's going to make an offer they can't refuse.
Yeah,
but yet Moses does refuse it. He doesn't
Right.
accept
Because he
the
says,
offer.
okay, fine, just don't go too far.
Yeah.
Just don't go too far. But Moses says no. And now we have again, Pharaoh's heart is still hardened with that kabod, with that heaviness.
And now we move into chapter 9, the
And
last few of these plagues that we're going to study
So
this
plague
week.
5 is with the plague over the livestock and the cattle. Pattern again, Aaron is not recorded in this acting role. And where it changes here, Adonai declares that the livestock of Bnei Israel and the Egyptian livestock will be distinguished. That's the same.
Yep.
But this judgment, as you are pointing out, is against another one of their gods.
Yeah. So this judgment is against what's called the bull god. And this bull god has been out there, and the cattle god, they have been out there for antiquities, have them
Right.
forever and ever. In fact, there have been great cemeteries where they have found embalmed cattle that have
Wow.
been excavated, because this symbol of the bull was the symbol of Pharaoh himself. So this is a pretty special one for Pharaoh. This one's
Wow.
going to hit the heart of Pharaoh. In fact, it's difficult there's an ancient hymn, an Egyptian hymn that's been excavated called the Hymn to Ammon. And in that hymn, it's difficult to distinguish between Pharaoh and the bull. They kind of interchange in the hymn itself, because this is like the chiefest of all gods. This is the one that Pharaoh is holding on to. Although Ra is considered the great god, the sun god, this one is the one that Pharaoh identifies with. And of course, we know Pharaoh is pretty much on himself. He's about Pharaoh. So this bull god is big. And so God is saying he's not big enough.
And here's what's interesting, where the pattern really shifts. Verse 6 tells us, the next day Adonai did the deed.
Yeah.
This is not Moses stretching out his hand. It's not Aaron. This is God himself attacks
Yeah.
the cattle.
And I think this is significant, because Pharaoh is so hung up on this is his God. This is the bull God. I'm the bull. And God is saying, yeah, you're not.
No, I am.
I'm the creator. And so God does this one himself without the assistance of the boys.
And
So,
Pharaoh's heart
important.
continues to be kabod, heavy with this. And he velo shilak vahayamin. He did not let the people go. Hayam. He did not let
And
the
so
people
the
go.
pattern, Adonai speaks to Moses and Aaron now, and then they throw soot from the furnace into the air. It lands, and then it becomes boils. That's chapter 9, starting at verse 8, going
Right.
through verse 12.
Tell us about this God.
So now it's against the god of healing, Imhotep. You might have even heard that name before,
Yeah.
Imhotep. This is was considered an outstanding nobleman, a god of the old kingdom, and this pharaoh of the old kingdom. He's not defied until later in the time of Exodus, but he was revered. We don't get his name till later, but he is revered throughout Egyptian history, and he can't do anything. He can't help heal this situation. So God is letting him know, not only have I established that I'm better than the bull god, that I'm the great God, that Pharaoh, you're not God, but when I put an injury out here, your other healing gods
Right.
can't heal it.
Wow.
I'm the only God that can heal it. But Pharaoh still chazak. He resolutely says, Lo Shema. I will
He does
not listen.
He does not listen. And then we look at the last plague that we're going to look at in this parsha, which
Yeah.
is the hail. Again, we've got Adonai speaks to Moses, and Moses goes early in the morning to see Pharaoh. And there's another shift that happens here.
Read this passage here. It's important.
This is verse 14. For this time I will send all my plagues to your heart. He's talking to Pharaoh.
How about that? We're going into the heart.
That's what God is interested in, is
Right,
our heart.
right.
And on your servants and on your people, so that you may know that there is none like me in all the earth. Surely by now I could have stretched out my hand and struck you and all your people with a plague that would have wiped you off the earth.
So right there, God is just saying, I'm talking to your heart. Don't you understand? Even though I've given you several little plagues, they seem big. I could have done this in one fell swoop
Right.
and ended all of Egypt.
Right. God's making
God's
a point.
making a point that he's showing grace.
And he says this, however, I have let you stand for this reason, to show you my power, and that my name might be proclaimed throughout the whole earth. Yet you still exalt yourself over my people by not letting them go. You hear to me this heart cry of God that I'm going to let you know, number one, I'm God of all the earth. We've talked about this in another parsha, that in this time, this pantheon of gods, and where you live in a multifaceted God worship society,
Yeah.
they're bound by their boundaries, their territories. They rule in territories,
Yeah.
not over the whole earth, which God is displaying and showing through all of these plagues that I'm over everything.
Yeah, and these gods are beings that were given by God power. God, the creator God, created little g gods, like he created angels, and gives them power. But they have taken that power, they have manipulated, they have abused. In fact, if you read Psalm 82, you'll learn that there's a council of gods, and God disciplines and rebukes these little gods. And some of that is right here in Egypt. We're seeing that play out here.
And then going on to verse 19 and 20, we see another huge pattern shift. It says, send word. He tells Pharaoh, send word to your people, shelter your cattle and all that you have in the field. For every person and animal found in the field and not brought home when the hail comes down on them will die. But whoever feared the word of Adonai among the servants of Pharaoh had his servants and cattle flee into the houses. But whoever disregarded the word of Adonai left his servants and the cattle in the field. This is the first time we've seen God send the warning. Now we know Israel is set apart. They're not experiencing these plagues.
They're in Goshen.
But now we see God has said, I'm doing this because I'm showing you I'm the God of everything.
Yeah.
And he's offering a way of escape to these Egyptians.
And I don't know. This is food for thought, right? I don't know that he's offering it to Pharaoh as much because I think he knows Pharaoh's heart.
Well,
It's
of
going
course
to be
he
hard.
does, yeah.
But he wants Pharaoh to save the people. And I think about regimes even today. There are regimes around the world where the government leaders are hardened, but the people would love grace, mercy, and love. They're not the same. And here we see God offering the Egyptian people an opportunity, trying to get Pharaoh to, hey, save your folks.
And you see that there is protection for those who Shema, who hear and obey. But those who lo Shema, are their cattle is struck and they're struck. So we see God provides a way of escape from death.
That's right.
Because whoever's in the field is going to die. And I think that's a huge significant shift that we see. And in this plague, we see that Moses himself is the one who brings this one on. We don't see Aaron, and it's not God. So we're going to begin to see this shift of Moses from being a fearful, I don't know how to speak, I need Aaron, to gaining his own strength. And it's almost as if this is kind of a God's boot camp for Moses in some ways, giving him strength.
Yeah, that's the pattern. It started with Aaron, then it moved to God had to do something himself, and Moses is starting to feel it. Now he's starting to feel like he can do something.
So Pharaoh responds now with this, what seems to be a repentant heart. I've sinned, I'm wrong, your God is righteous. But we see that this Parsha ends. Moses doesn't buy it. He knows that he's not being genuine. And this Parsha actually ends in verse 35. After all of this false repenting and dealing with Moses, it says, so Pharaoh's heart was hardened. And this hardened is that chazak. It is resolute. And he did not let Bnei Israel go, just as Adonai had said by Moses' hand.
And so if there's hardness in your heart, even God pushing on it, you have to ask God, make me a broken person. Let me be broken, Lord. And this is what the psalmist wrote. God looks after a broken and contrite spirit. So may we all take this to heart, that we will not be like Pharaoh. And in areas where our hearts may be hard, may we all say, Father, give us a broken and a contrite spirit. Until next time, we thank you for being with us. God bless you, and shalom.
Shalom.